الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters in Islam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shower us with His mercy and with His blessings this morning of Saturday, February 16th, 2019, in which we are gathered to discuss the great Hadeeth of Zara, Hadeeth, or the narration which Aisha radiallahu anha narrates about 11 women and their husbands and how they lived with their husbands, what were the experiences with their husbands, and spousal interaction between husbands and wives. So in our previous lectures, we covered about 7 of the women's different narrations about their husbands, and today we're going to cover maybe the 8th woman's narrative about her husband, and then move on to possibly the 9th woman's narrative. So in this narration, Aisha radiallahu anha, she says that the 8th woman, she said, Zawji al-massa massa arnab wa rihu rihu zarnab. Aisha, she said, Zawji al-massu massa al-arnab wa rihu rihu zarnab. She said, my husband is soft to the touch, like a rabbit, and his smell is like zarnab. Zarnab is a kind of sweet smelling grass. So this woman, this 8th woman, here she's praising her husband and describing him as one who has smooth skin, like rabbit's fur, soft and smooth. This is the meaning of arnab. And she describes his scent as a sweet-smelling grass, and his body is gentle and soft. It is not rough and tough and weathered by the sun and hard work. And she compared her husband's body to that of a smooth rabbit's fur. So why did she compare her husband and his softness to that of the fur of a rabbit? Not only to describe his physical characteristics, that his body is smooth as rabbit's fur, he has smooth skin, he has nice hair, smooth hair, but she also intended that his personality was smooth and his personality was easy, and that he was a good companion to live with. She also went on to explain his other praiseworthy traits and characteristics and compared her husband to Zarnab. Zarnab is like a sweet-smelling grass, somewhat similar to the smell of a pine or an evergreen tree, and it grows in the desert areas. So she wanted to compare her husband's behavior amongst other people like that of a sweet-smelling grass, that everyone loves to smell, everyone loves to be around with, and his good manners and etiquettes give off good energy, just as the sweet-smelling grass or the scent of pine does when people come around it. Or she could have meant that her husband always uses good-smelling perfume. So she could have intended all of these meanings in her statement, but definitely her husband, his good manners, his good smell, his good reputation amongst others has a positive effect upon her. And if we notice throughout this narrative of Aisha radiallahu anha, we find that each woman used words that were somewhat in correlation with the description of their husbands. The women who described their husbands with rough, tough, or difficult traits used heavy and strong Arabic words. And the women who described their husbands with nice, easy, praiseworthy, kind traits used easy and light Arabic words. She also chose words that rhyme together, like many of the other women did as well. Here she chose the word arnab and zarnab. And these are from the types of manners that we should learn as husbands and wives. Both spouses and wives should try to have the best of appearances, the best of smells when around each other, and try to remove any foul or any bad scents that could offend or push the other individual away. Aisha radiallahu anha, she narrates about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the first thing that he would do when he would enter his house was to clean his mouth, was to use the what? Use the miswak. Use the miswak on his teeth and on his tongue. So that when he entered upon Aisha, and if he kissed her, if he greeted her, she would smell nothing but goodness from the mouth of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is something that men should be, and husbands specifically, should be conscious of when they enter into their homes before they go greet their wife and their families. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would remove any foul smells from his mouth before entering to see his wife and family. So both spouses should practice this, both the man and the woman. So this woman here, the eighth woman, she basically is praising her husband and says that he is a good companion, and she didn't forget to mention that he smells good as well. So then the ninth woman, moving on to the ninth woman, she says, Zawji Rafi'ul Imad, Tawilul Najad, Azimul Ramad, Qaribul Bayti Minan Nad. Okay, she said, Zawji Rafi'ul Imad, Tawilul Nijad, Azimul Rimad, or Ramad, wa Qaribul Bayti Minan Nad. So the ninth woman, she said, my husband is a tall man, wearing a long strap for carrying his sword, wearing a long sheath to carry his sword. His ashes are abundant, and his house is near to the people who could easily access him or easily consult him. So here, this woman, she's describing her husband with some of the greatest traits and characteristics amongst the Arabs. Number one, she's describing her husband as someone who is tall, but his tallness is different than the tallness of other men who was described by his wife. This one is tall, but his body is in proportion. He also wears a long sheath for his sword. And everyone always seeks him out for help and depends upon him for aid, help and assistance in their affairs. People come from far and near to be with him. He helps the poor, he is very generous with his guests, and relieves the destitute. When she said to her that her husband is Rafi'ul Imad, this can mean that he comes from a noble household of noble lineage and noble family, as the houses used to be supported by an imad, okay, by pillars, or the tents. If they lived in tents, they used to be supported by an imad, which would be the pole that is in the center of the tent. So what the scholars of Balagha, what they say she meant was that she was describing her husband as someone who was dignified and noble, as it is known that the Arabs were well respected, honored, and dignified, and their houses were up on the mountains, away from the flooded areas and away from the landslides during the rainy season. So the scholars of Balagha, they also say that this can also mean that an individual is very generous and also has a lot of wealth. Then she goes on to describe his stature, his physical stature, Tawilun Nijad, saying that he is very tall. Okay, and this is always a praiseworthy trait amongst the Arabs as well. And being short is a dispraiseworthy trait. So from this hadith, we also learn about the virtues of generosity and the dispraise of stinginess. Then when we see this here, this narration, she goes on to describe another praiseworthy trait of her husband. When she says, Azim al-Ramad. Azim al-Ramad, this is talking about his extreme generosity. So when she described her husband as one whose ashes are abundant, she meant that he is very, very generous. His ashes are abundant. Why? How is her describing her husband as his ashes being abundant? How is this a sign of his generosity? Okay, his ashes are abundant from all of the guests that he hosts, all of the animals that he slaughters, and all of the wood that he burns to prepare the meals for all of his guests, and cooking for his guests and hosting his guests. So the firewood that he collects is constantly being burnt, and the ashes are collecting constantly from the frequency that he is cooking and hosting his guests. So here his wife is praising him for his generosity. These are the types of characteristics that the Arabs used to encourage each other, and they would try to practice. As it is well known that generosity, when you are constantly generous with people and always are described with characteristics of karam, okay, being bountiful with the people and being generous with the people, that generosity is a trait and characteristic that hides and covers up every deficiency and shortcoming. Just as stinginess and being cheap will never reveal any good deeds and always overwhelms the person's character. So the stingy person has no good deeds at all when you see somebody who is stingy and all you think about is their stinginess. And there are many verses that speak about being stingy in the Quran. From amongst them is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, الَّذِينَ يَبْخَلُونَ وَيَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبُخْلِ وَيَكْتُمُونَ مَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ وَأَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَذَابًا مُهِينًا. Those who are stingy and enjoin other people to be stingy and conceal what Allah has given them of His bounty, we have prepared for the disbelievers a humiliating punishment. As well as many hadith that the Prophet Muhammad spoke about the stingy people. And the books of Islam, of history, of biographies are filled with mention of stingy people and their humiliating state, contrary to the generous people and those who were known for their generosity, such as Hatem al-Ta'i, who is used amongst the Arabs and in Arabic poetry as an example of generosity. On one occasion, it was narrated that he saw his son hitting a dog. So he said to his son, "Oh, my son, don't hit the dog. Because the dog, it helps us and guides our guests so that we can host them. Because the guests can see the fire being burnt or hear the dog burning." So from the stories of some stingy people of the past is that there were two men walking on one occasion. And there was a stingy man who was swimming. And he was close to drowning. So he called out, "Please help me." So one of the men said, "Give me your hand." He said, Give me your hand." So the stingy man who was drowning didn't reach out his hand. But the second man was smarter. So he said, "Take my hand." The first one said, "Give me your hand." The second one said, "Take my hand." And he didn't say, "Give me your hand," because he knew that giving things was not from the stingy person's character, even if that would lead him to death, solely because he is not used to using the word "give me." So there are many books that were authored about stinginess, about bukhul, and the stingy people. Al-Jahith, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, Ibn al-Jawzi, they authored books which specifically mention narratives of stinginess and the stingy people. So stinginess, brothers and sisters, is a bad trait and characteristic to have and highly disliked, and especially amongst the Arabs. Just as there are those who are stingy, there are also those who are very generous, and they are known to be extremely generous. And they're not satisfied unless they give something. And the true value and worth of a person is measured in how much they give, not how much they take. Listen to these verses of poetry, which will translate that Umayyah ibn Abi Salt, he said about Abdullah ibn Jad'an. He said, "Should I let you know that I need something? Or should it be sufficient that you already understand what I'm talking about? When you see someone praising you or making dua for you when they meet you, the generous one already knows that the person is hinting to asking to help him. So he doesn't make the needy person ask for help. These are the characteristics of the generous. The generous people, they don't wait for the needy person to ask them because he's already known as a generous person and he doesn't hesitate to give. And with this in mind, the great Imam Sufyan ibn Uyayna, he mentioned this hadith in his book, entitled it The Supplication to Remove Hardships. The supplication when you say, La ilaha illallah al-halim al-hakim, La ilaha illallah rabbul arsh al-azim, La ilaha illallah rabbus samawati wal-ardi wa rabbul arsh al-kareem. this great dua. He mentioned it in his books, and Waqi', one of the other great scholars of Islam, he said with each wording, La ilaha illallah, is to be included. So this supplication is praising of Allah and not asking Him. So why did they call it the supplication of hardships or the supplication of distress? When it was said to Sufyan ibn Uyayna, this is not a supplication, rather it is a praise of Allah. So Sufyan ibn Uyayna, he responded, he said, yes, of course it is. And then he recited those verses of poetry and said, if this is someone from the creation who is sufficed with people's praise, then what about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If the servant says these words of praise to Allah and understands them, then what about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High? So then, in this narrative, this woman, she goes on to describe her husband as Qareebul Bayti min an-Nad, Qareebul Bayti min an-Nad, which is also an analogy used to express how generous he was. That he's easily accessible to the people. His house is close to the center of the town or the city, or close to the masjid, or close to the neighborhood. He mixes with the people. He socializes with them and interacts with them, and he meets and greets them with a smiling face, an open heart, and an open house. And he hastily invites them over so that he can host them and feed them. And it could also mean, okay, Qareebul Bayti min an-Nad, it could also mean an analogy that describes his nobility and honorable status he has amongst his townspeople. And that if the townspeople differ in anything, then he is the one that they always refer to for guidance and direction and consultation, because he is close to all of them. So this woman here, she is praising her husband for his generosity. And from the proofs, from her description of him that he is generous, is when she said that his home is close to the places where people gather. His house is not far away in the suburbs, far away from the people, or on the outskirts of the town, where guests would not be comfortable or they would not want to be invited. Rather, his home is close to the center of town, that anyone can come and visit him anytime they like. And the closest example of this is the one whose house and residence is close to the masjid, and we want to drink some water. So the one who is closest to the masjid, we would call out to him, hey brother, can you give us some water? So this individual places himself and lives in areas where he is easily accessible to the people. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us from what we heard today from these two women's narratives about their husbands. And inshallah ta'ala, we will continue on finishing up this great hadith, which contains numerous benefits and endless amount of gems and teachings that we can learn to practice in our lives on a daily basis, and especially how we can deal with our spouses in our homes and with our families. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us from what we heard today. Jazakumullahu khair wa barakallahu feek. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.